And the recording is in progress. You in cyberspace are muted at the moment, but we hope that you will chime in during the discussion either by raising your actual physical hands or use the hand button on the screen, or just put questions and comments in the chat bar. We will fold you in. And if you do speak, please remember to mute and unmute yourself as appropriate. And here in the room, when you are recognized during question and answer, please use the microphones that in theory are on your tables. They soon will be. And when they appear, please speak into them, because otherwise we can't hear you in the far reaches of the room, and that makes us sad. Martin Chuzzlewit is usually described as Dickens' sixth novel. It follows Old Curiosity Shop and began appearing in 1842 when Dickens was 30 and the father of 4. It finished its serial run in 1844, and during those 2 years, in addition to completing Chuzzlewit, Dickens also traveled to America and Canada, produced his nonfiction travel book, American Notes, banged out A Christmas Carol, and fathered another baby. And you wonder what the conversations about work-life balance sounded like in that house. Speaking of underachievers, Bill Goldstein holds a PhD from City University of New York. He is a Dickens completist, a writer, an editor, a book review and critic on Page and Screen, and a past director of public programs at Roosevelt House and Hunter College, among other things. His first book was a luminous biography of the year 1922 and the birth of modernism in English literature. And he is currently at work on a life of the writer and social activist Larry Kramer. And it just occurred to me that we might should have an extra points question tonight about whether, if the social activist Charles Dickens and Larry Kramer met, would they have love for hate each other? Virginia Bartow is also an accomplished reader, writer, teacher, a Dickensian in general, and profoundly a bookwoman in particular. She is senior rare books cataloger at the New York Public Library and also a dedicated member of the Grolier Club, the nation's oldest organization of bibliophiles and enthusiasts of the graphic arts. Her list of interests and professional accomplishments is long, but she particularly asked me not to mention the time she was arrested for camping without a permit in February at Kettle Moraine State Park in Wisconsin in 1983. So of course I will not.
So I think I'm going to go first. Am I on?
Yeah.
Okay. When Beth asked me to do this novel, it isn't one that I remember finishing or enjoying or remembered the ending of. And I thought, well, this is going to be a challenge. So 2 things happened. One, I decided I would do the images. I would do the pictures in the book. And the other was that I read something, and it's a story that doesn't have any factual background, but Dickens and Dostoevsky met. And Dostoevsky is said to have written a letter to a friend and said, Mr. Dickens told me that all of his characters were part of himself, and the bad characters were as he was, and the good characters were as he should be. So that really allowed me to read the book. You see, I could read the bad characters as this is how people act, including Charles Dickens' thoughts, right? Because a lot of it is I would have done, or I was murderous, or he was murderous. And then the other was that the good people were as he should be. And I thought, well, that was it. It opened it up and I was allowed to read it. I was happy to read it. So today I was doing a little work at the Grolier Club, just thinking fill in every moment before Bill and I got here. And I was able to learn a little bit about Dickens writing the novel. He got the contract with Chapman and Hall, and they agreed to pay him £200 a month and 3/4 of the profits for every new story that he was going to write. He got 150 pounds a month until the first part for Martin Chuzzlewit was received. And if profits were insufficient to cover the loss, his cost, his in earnings would be deducted from the 200 pounds to be paid monthly. With this guaranteed income, he went to America. He had 150 pounds a month and he took his trip to America before he wrote a thing. The other codicil that was negotiated in his contract, if the sales failed, the 200 pounds a month would be reduced to 50 pounds. Well, Dickens objected to that. And he talked to Forster, who was negotiating his contract, and he said, you need to go and approach Bradbury and Evans. We're going to leave at Chapman and Hall. In installment 7, Mr. Hall wanted to invoke that part of the contract and to pay him less than 200 pounds a month, go down to 50 because the book wasn't selling. Right. And then we learn that he starts to put this middle of the book about America to engage the public, and it did work. It engaged more people, but he left Chapman and Hall after A Christmas Carol, which was already under contract, and after Chuzzlewit was finished under contract. So I thought that was kind of interesting. I didn't know that about the publishing history. Now let's just talk about the pictures. So I also learned sort of late in my research that people think that these are the best illustrations that Fizz ever did for Dickens in Martin Chuzzlewit. Again, a novel that didn't really sell well. So I'm going to see, this is going to work, right? Ramon, you're brilliant. So here on the left is the frontispiece, and you see in the very center the character at the organ, right? You see Tom Pinch, his sister Ruth, and John Westlock standing over the organ console. Right, that's the center drawing, and I think you see some other characters around him, but I blew it up because the entire illustration is going to be this big, literally, physically this big on the page. And that's a little generous. But up in the right-hand corner, you see Tom Pinch working at his desk. And I'm going to tell you that I know my Latin pronunciation I learned in Chicago, so it's not going to meet any of your Eastern standards, but sic vos non vobis. And it comes, thus do you, but not for you, from Virgil. In other words, you do the work, another takes the credit. This is in this little tiny vignette, little tiny illustration. And the other title, Si Monumentum Requiris. Now this is the word that I don't get, circumspice. Anyway, it means if you see his monument, look around you, and it's the epitaph on the monument to Sir Christopher Wren, the architect of London. So there's all these literary references right in this little tiny vignette in the upper right-hand corner. Then on the right, you see Tom Pinch and Mary Pecksniff, the Pecksniff daughters. And then below that, Ruth, he's consoling Ruth when he goes to visit her when she's a governess, right? And she's crying and can't console. Then down at the bottom, at the very bottom of the picture, you get, I blew it up, you get all these Pecksniffs with their masks, smiling mask, and then all of his different like actual emotions. I just thought, this is all done with an iPhone 12 and the actual first edition in the library. So here's the dragon, right? So you have the dragon, Mrs. Lupin, and what's his name? I can't remember his name. Mark Tapley. And then here's Mrs. Gamp with her bottles. And then in the background, all of her patients, the elderly and the babies. Isn't that cute? Yeah. And then over on the right is Paul Sweetlepipe. And he's got his wig, and then the birds. And there's a little Bailey Jr. standing behind him. That's all in the vignette. And then here's a blow up here. Ruth and John and. So here's the title page. London, Chapman and Hall, 1844. Now it was published in 20 parts. And the last part was parts 19 and 20. And it took about a year, as Beth said. he went from weekly parts to monthly parts with this one. He didn't want to write every week. He didn't want to publish every week. And it says with illustrations by Fizz. Now, Fizz became his illustrator in Pickwick. He took over, whoop, that was me. He took over illustrating Dickens novels in Pickwick. So this is, he's well into it with Dickens at this point. And here's his title page design, all drawn on steel, drawn and engraved by Fizz. He engraved his own plates. And he engraved them 2 up. Well, we'll see a picture of a plate in a little while, and I'll explain that to you. So here's a close-up, and you'll see in the next slide, but I can't figure out what scene this is because this looks like Mr. Pecksniff and one of the young architects, but it doesn't, I don't remember it appearing in the novel. But there's the coach going into London or to out from London. And there's that horse, that lovely horse that his legs go up and down, but he doesn't go forward or backward. And there's plans in the front seat. And then here, this, is there a pointer on this one, Ramon?
It doesn't work on the other piece.
Okay, so in the middle, there's a posted bill and it says 100 and the pound sign is to the right instead of to the left. Fizz, like Whistler, engraved what he saw and it printed in reverse. So this is the kind of mistake he would make. And it is a point. So, in book collecting, you always want a point. You want the first impression of the first issue and you want the first impression of every plate. And this appeared in the parts, but ironically, Eccles also says it appeared in some of the bound volumes. So a book in parts would come out monthly and it would be 5 shillings. And then at 6 months, you'd get volume 1. And then at 12 months, you'd get volume 2, and you could buy the 2-volume hardcover. But he said, Eccles said that some of the hardcover copies that were issued by the publisher, and I do have the figures here if you're curious, did have this plate in it. It was uncorrected plate. So he had to redraw the plate. So here's Mr. Pecksniff and his charming daughters and Tom Pinch in the first chapter. And I just want you to pay attention. I think it's the next slide. Yeah. Pay attention. Here's Pecksniff, Fade, which we know he didn't do, right? He didn't do his own drawings. He used the students' drawings. And the sanctimonious look on his face, right? While spouting all these really platitudes. And then I can't read, and even in the blow up, you can't read what that little object is on the mantelpiece, but it does say something. And then here we have Martin Chuzzlewit suspects a landlady without reason. And we get Mrs. Lupin and old Martin and Mary Graham in this shot. And then there's the blow, I blew it up so you get to see. And this is all occurring in a space of about 2.5 inches by 1.5 inch. But here he is rewriting his will, right? That he burned. And at the end, we found out what he said in it. And then here's the Pecksniff family party. And I listed all the members and you get to see their faces and their characteristics from the text. The man with spots on his face and spots on his waistcoat. You can't tell where his face and his waistcoat. And the gay bachelor, the young gentleman, grandnephew of Mr. Chuzzlewit, very dark and very hairy. And Chevy Slime. And Mortimer Tigg, Montague Tigg at this point, right? He becomes Tigg Montague later. So I remember, Beth, you remember your husband passed me a note the last time we were here and he put a word on it, hypocrite. So you have to also look at all of these characters, that they're positive and negative, they flip, they don't flip, they stay, they're opposites of one another. So you have all these people that, change their ways, like Tigg Montague becomes Montague Tigg. Right. And there's a close-up of the 3 daughters with the red noses. It was a lot of fun, and I used George's book a lot to identify the people in the initial stages, because he does the characterization so well, and he does chapter by chapter who everybody is and what they're doing. And here's Tom Pinch picking up young Martin Chuzzlewit, the new student in the livery stable. It's a very pretty picture of him. He actually has a nice smile on his face. He's happy to meet him. And then here we have the, on a social occasion, I don't know if you remember, but young Martin tells Tom Pinch to eat and drink everything he wants just after Mr. Pecksniff leaves and won't give him a drink. And then here we have on the mantle, we have something called Pecksniff's Pump, which figures in the novel as well. So Pecksniff is looking at his own pump saying, aren't I a wonderful fellow? And there he's looking, giving himself his own side eye. And I used this Cambridge printed at the Riverside Press, 1868. So this is an American edition. And the reason I did it is it has proof impressions from the plates that were engraved by Fizz, and also some from FOC Darley. This Martin Chuzzlewit is not illustrated by all these people. It's a series of the works of Dickens. It was published at the Riverside Press in Boston. So here we have, and these were great because they were something called Sheen Collet. Well, we're getting a little ahead of this now. So I read about this thriving city of Eden was compared to Cairo, Illinois. And there was a land scam in Cairo, Illinois, where this person named Darius Blake Holbrook, the Cairo City and Canal Company, sold property that was a swamp. And Dickens, when he passes there on the riverboat, he says, "At length upon the morning of the third day, we arrived at a spot so much more desolate than any we had yet beheld, that the forlornest place we had passed were in comparison with it full of interest. At the junction of the two rivers, on ground so flat and low and marshy that at certain seasons of the year it is inundated to the housetops, lies a breeding place of fever, ague, and death, vaunted in England as a mine of golden hope, and speculated in on the faith of monstrous representations to many people's ruin. A dismal swamp on which the half-built houses rot away, cleared here and there for the space of a few yards, and teeming then with the rank, unwholesome vegetation in whose baleful shade the wretched wanderers who are tempted hither droop and die and lay their bones. The hateful Mississippi circling and eddying before it, and turning off on its southern course, a slimy monster hideous to behold, a hotbed of disease, an ugly sepulchre, and a grave uncheered by any gleam of promise, a place without one single quality in earth or air or water to commend it. Such is the dismal Cairo." And he puts that right into the novel, yes. So this is on his American tour. And here we have the picture, Mark Tapley and Martin looking at the botanical garden, the market, the church, the pump, the theater, the wharf, the baths, the chapel. And then in the next slide, the actual plate. So this is an interesting thing. There was a lively correspondence between Dickens and Fizz. Dickens told Fizz exactly what scenes he wanted him to illustrate. So in this case, he describes what he wants in the print. And I'm not going to read the whole thing because it's pretty long and we've got to give Bill some time here, but respecting the American scenes, the artist desired more details, right? Because he hadn't been to America. So he needed Dickens to describe what he was supposed to engrave. And he says, okay, so here I'm sending you another vignette from through Chapman and Hall of tenants in front of a wretched log hut. But then he goes on to say it's perfectly flat, swampy, wretched, stunted timber, filthy river, miserable log houses around it, tumble down and ruinous, of all is labeled bank and national credit office, outside the door. And then he goes on to describe what should be there, the dresser, the stump, the sharp axe, and this. So here's what Fizz writes back to him, right? He says, yeah, these are elaborate directions, and he's written underneath the note, I can't get all this perspective in unless you will allow of a long subject, something less than a mile. So he writes back and says, I can't get all that in one picture. And here's the close-up that he does. Right, so you get the stump, his architect's drawings, you know, Mark Tapley with the sharp axe, the sort of dresser with their kitchen on it outside their shack. Now, I include this one. It's not a very interesting slide, but I include it for a reason. So this is Mr. Model with Charity Pecksniff. And she's wooing him, he's wooing her, he's escaping from her. And here on the table, you see Childe Harold's pilgrimage. Right? Because what is it said about Childe Harold, right? That he you know, he's melancholy, just like Mr. Model, melancholy, depressed, not in love, plagued by love. And then at her feet, in this case, this is a print from a plate, and it doesn't say anything, but in the other one, in the one in the first edition, it does say something, and there is only one passage, and it's at the very end, and it's about Tom Pinch sitting next to the small child of Mary Graham. And the little girl loves him and wants to be with him. And when she gets sick, he sits by her. And those are the words that are on the book in the first edition. And this is why I include it, because the library in the George Aaron's collection has a steel plate. And they have a proof of the steel plate, and it doesn't say that on the book in the proof. So what I wanted to say is this is a steel plate. This is not the plate that was printed in the book. This is a plate that was engraved by Fizz for sale by the publisher, because the plates for this book, as described by Kyton, who's the authority, were 2 up. So they should have had 2 prints on either side that were the same size as the page of the book. And you could get 2 prints every time you roll the engraving through the press. And this is just something that was done for aftermarket. And the publishers and the illustrators made lots of money publishing the illustrations after the book was sold. And here's a letter from Chapman and Hall saying that this is actually one of the steel plates engraved by Fizz, which is true, just not one of the ones that appear in the book. And he did engrave it.
That's Evelyn Waugh's father who signed that.
Was it? Oh, wait, let's go back.
Arthur Waugh was Evelyn Waugh's father. He was the head of Chapman and Hall.
Excellent. So here's the plate that appears in the book on the right, and then the plate that was engraved. Right, so they don't quite match up. And then this is the famous plate in all of Dickens. And it's Mrs. Gamp proposes a toast. And I just want to read you a passage from the book that was the part that really stimulated my interest. That the 2 midwives in a friendly chat, surrounded by bandboxes and other accessories, while behind her seen the immortal Sarah's rusty gowns, which, depending from the bedposts, had so adapted themselves by long usage to her figure that more than one impatient husband, coming in precipitately at about the time of twilight, had been for an instant stricken dumb by the supposed discovery that Mrs. Gamp had hanged herself. And there are the rusty gowns. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Bridget. So I wanted to talk a little bit, get into the plot a little later. I wanted to talk about, well, first I came to read Martin Chuzzlewit last summer, and I think I was invited to speak here because Beth was relieved to find that someone had already read Martin Chuzzlewit. She said, I'm Dickens complete, because I've sort of been making my way through rereading some of the books I did read in college, and after that, also reading books like Martin Chuzzlewit I haven't read, and now, as I'm saying to Anne Kirchner sitting here, I still have Barnaby Rudge ahead of me, and I'm not sure I'll make it before I die. Missy McKee said, well, we'll bury me with it. Read it in the beyond. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the way in which other writers thought about Martin Chuzzlewit, whether they consciously thought about it or accidentally thought about it, but I'm thinking in particular of Anthony Trollope. I think the last time we were here for Oliver Twist, there were a lot of Trollope partisans, and I am one of them. But he came to publish, well, he wrote his autobiography in 1876. It wasn't published till after he died. But in the autobiography, he talks a lot about his own writing, and then he also includes a chapter on the history of the English novel, and then also his thoughts on contemporary novelists, including the people he most revered, who were Thackeray and George Eliot, and then Dickens he placed as third. But I wanted to just read a little of what he said, because it reflects, I think, on the low estimation a lot of people have about Martin Chuzzlewit as this sort of lesser Dickens, or not one of the ones you would tell your friends to read, like Great Expectations or Bleak House or a number of other books. It is evident from all Thackeray's best work that he lived with the characters he was creating. And this is really throughout the autobiography, Trollope's estimation of a novelist's greatness is something about the characters that comes to life. And he has a number of passages, particularly about the Pallisers and the characters in the Palliser novels, about how he lived with them. And of course, he lived with them over many years. He wrote 6 novels about them over 15 years. But the way in which he, as the writer, knew everything that they would think, everything that they had done, everything that they would do, and he lived with the characters in that way. He goes on very beautifully about it. So the novelist living with the characters seems to be a kind of key element in his judgment. There can be no doubt that the most popular novelist of my time, probably the most popular English novelist of any time, has been Charles Dickens. He has now been dead nearly 6 years. He died in June of 1870. And the sale of his books goes on as it did during his life. The certainty with which his novels are found in every house, the familiarity of his name in all English-speaking countries, the popularity of such characters as Mrs. Gamp, Micawber, and Pecksniff, and many others whose names have entered into the English language and become well-known words, the grief of the country at his death, and the honors paid to him at his funeral, all testify to his popularity. Since the last book he wrote himself, I doubt whether any book has been so popular as his biography by John Forster. And what I think is so remarkable about it is that most people, as I say, would not consider Martin Chuzzlewit one of Dickens' most important or memorable novels, probably not in 1876 or now. But what's amazing is that Trollope gives 3 characters names. 2 of them are from Martin Chuzzlewit, which by this point is a 35-year-old novel. And when that just seems to me to mean that it stayed in his mind in a way that is different from all of the other novels of Dickens, including far more recent ones that would have been the greater novels considered by many. But as I said, he still puts him behind Thackeray and George Eliot. I do acknowledge that Mrs. Gamp, Micawber, Pecksniff, and others have become household words in every house as though they were human beings. But to my judgment, they are not human beings, nor are any of the characters humans which Dickens has portrayed here. It has been the peculiarity and the marvel of this man's power that he has invested his puppets with a charm that has enabled him to dispense with human nature. Nor is the pathos of Dickens human. It is stagey and melodramatic, but it is so expressed that it touches every heart a little. Though they are not human beings, we all remember Mrs. Gamp and Pickwick. The Boffins and Veneerings were characters in Our Mutual Friend, which was Dickens' last completed novel. The Boffins and Veneerings do not, I think, dwell in the minds of so many. I just love that, but it is so expressed that it touches every heart A little. I just love that, a little. So what's interesting about mentioning the boffins and veneerings is that at the same time that Our Mutual Friend was being published, which began in May of 1864, and Virginia has talked about Fizz, January 1864 was the first part of Trollope's novel, Can You Forgive Her, which is probably his favorite among his books. I think he talked about it in his autobiography. But what's marvelous and horrifying, and a link with Dickens, and why I think he might have been particularly thinking of the boffins and the veneerings, is that the publisher of Can You Forgive Her, which I think was Chapman and Hall actually, hired Fizz to do the illustrations, and Trollope was furious at his illustrations. He was very disappointed by them, and he objected, and he tried to get H.K. Brown, whose name was Fizz, fired, and he was so mad that Brown wrote to a friend. Dickens probably thinks, oh, sorry, the other thing is that, so this book appears in January of 1864, Can You Forgive Her? The parts begin, A Mutual Friend begins in May, and so Dickens fires Brown and hires a different illustrator altogether. So he's breaking off this relationship that by that point had been going on 30 years. Dickens probably thinks a new hand would give his old puppets a fresh look, Fizz wrote to his friend. Or perhaps he does not like my illustrating Trollope neck and neck with him, though by jingo he need fear no rivalry there. Confound all authors and publishers, say I, there is no pleasing one or t'other. And as John Hall, who was Trollope's biographer, says, it annoyed Trollope to see in the characters that Brown drew for Can You Forgive Her such clear family resemblances to Dickens' characters. Inhuman and inhuman and unnatural puppets out of Dickens seemed to have wandered onto his, Trollope's, pages. So I think Our Mutual Friend, even 12 years later, was just a source of horrible anger on the part of Trollope. And again, this comparison that people were always, he's always neck and neck with him. And I think he feared by jingo that there was no rivalry there. But one of the things, so these weird connections between Dickens and Trollope, envy, obviously, and I think Trollope almost basically admits it. But if we flash forward a little bit to talk about Martin Chuzzlewit and why I think he was in his mind when he wrote his autobiography, is that John Forster's Life of Dickens appeared in December of 1871, so about 5 years before, 4 or 5 years before Trollope begins his own autobiography. But one of the things that was so remarkable about the book, which George Eliot and Trollope both objected to it on moral grounds or grounds of taste, because this was the biography in which was revealed what Dickens' childhood was like, and that he had been working in the blacking company, and his poverty that even his children didn't know about. So there was a kind of distaste about it, but also as a biography, it was just very disorganized, and it was letters and reminiscences, but not a well-structured book. So George Eliot writes to a friend saying that despite all of this, so you really should read it because it's most revelatory about his childhood. And then also for the letters from America that you alluded to, that these were different from the book American Notes, which had been published in 1842. And these George Eliot felt were really revelatory. They were the most interesting thing in the book. So if you have this book being published in 1871, that once again brings Dickens' trip to America, and then it makes everything about Martin Chuzzlewit more current. But I love this too. So Frederick Carl wrote a biography of George Eliot. So Middlemarch, the first serial part of Middlemarch, appears in December of 1871, which is the same time as John Forster's biography of Dickens begins. And as Frederick Carl writes, Eliot rued that Forster's Life of Dickens was selling better than Middlemarch, which she says was the result of a fickle British reading public willing to pay more, this is quite unusual, for expensive biographies than fiction. She was, of course, omitting that this was Dickens and that it provided new evidence of his phenomenal development from street urchin to world figure. Surely she could not have expected to compete here. In any event, Middlemarch held its own. Her remarks further indicate how competitive Eliot felt, not only with biography, because that's in many ways what she's doing in Middlemarch, she's writing a fictional biography of Dorothea as well as the town and other characters, but her remarks further indicate how competitive Eliot felt, not only with biography, but with Dickens himself, and possibly her rueful remark reveals a displeasure that with Dickens dead at last, the field should be hers, except for Forster and his tales from the tomb. So the thing is, so this is the 1870s that we find Trollope talking about Mrs. Gamma and Pecksniff in particular. But there's just this wonderful other link between them. You just feel Trollope has Dickens in the back and saying they can't get him out, and whether they're puppets or whatever they are, they're living, he's living with them just as he's living with his own characters. So I don't know how many people have read the Barset series. The fifth novel is called Small House, no, the fourth novel is the Small House at Allington. And that was published beginning in July of 1862. So this is 16 years, almost 20 years after, no, 18 years after Martin Chuzzlewit. And I love how meta it becomes at one point. So there's a fictional character. If you've read this book, there's a character named John Eames. He lives in Barsetshire, but also in London. That's his story. And so he's living in a boarding house of somewhat not ill repute, because that sounds like a brothel, but it's not the fanciest lodgings that anyone could have. So the woman who runs the house is serving at dinner. I'd never wish to sleep out of London for my part, says Mrs. Roper, said Mrs. Roper. She's the woman who runs the house. When a woman's got a house over her head, I don't think her mind's ever easy out of it. I hope you'll be more lucky with your lodgers than I have been with some of mine. But one of the women who is a lodger who can't pay their bills claims that she's going to leave and then she's going to open up her own lodging house. Jemima, hand the potatoes to Miss Spruce. Miss Spruce, do let me send you a little more gravy. There's plenty here, really. And then it says in the novel, Mrs. Roper was probably thinking of Mrs. Todgers. So I love how Trollope is not only thinking, but he makes his own fictional character, who he's been living with, think of Dickens' puppet, which somehow has lodged itself in his brain just at the mention of a lodging house or at the mention of gravy or whatever has brought it to mind. It's just, he cannot get rid of Mrs. Todger almost 20 years later. So the way that this puppet has come to represent something that means something to Trollope, but also he knows will mean something to his readers. And it's even more delightful, I think, because in the, sorry to get so footnoty, but if in the Penguin edition of the novel, the editor corrects it to read Mrs. Todger, but in the first edition, which Oxford World Classics reprints, he says she was probably thinking of Mr. Todger. And of course, there is no Mr. Todger, as the footnote in the Oxford University Press and Penguin edition both explain. But I love that one editor corrects it, and perhaps it was Trollope who either made the mistake himself at 20 years distance, or it was something that the printer made an error and he didn't catch it in proofreading. But Mr. Todger and Mrs. Todger somehow exist in Trollope's brain. And then I started thinking, well, I love that he makes him Mr. Todger, because misremembering it means that there's something that's very different about his lodging house, even if it's just the gravy portioned out, but somehow he's remembering Dickens as having a Mr. running it as opposed to a Mrs. So I told you it was going to get very meta. But the other thing is that Trollope loves to do this in Small House at Allington. He also mentions something about a woman in white, which is a reference to the woman in white, but not a reference to the novel. So it's again this kind of way in which fiction lives in Trollope's brain, although the thing about the woman in white is that it was just published in 1860 or 1861. So it's a very current novel as opposed to this long ago book. So that's really all I wanted to say, except that one thing that we haven't talked about here is the American scene, and that I had always heard, oh, these are so weak and so terrible and so satirical and so ill-tempered and ill-judged. And Washington Irving, who was an admirer of Dickens, was so offended by this. And as some people have claimed, that said, well, it's no more jaundiced a view of America than it is of England. But I wanted to talk about, in particular, some of the politics, of what's happening in Eden, because I found it very bracing last summer to be reading these passages that begin and end chapter 21 in particular. And the way in which I wasn't really, until I reread it to prepare for this, thinking of how carefully, as disparate as these storylines are, how carefully Dickens has really worked them together. And this was the first of his novels. Dombey and Son is even more so, and then David Copperfield is even more so than that, and each one after that is more planned out. But this is the first book in which he, at least in letters to Forster, said that he sat down and had to plan out a million little details before he began. I mean, whether he did that or not is hard to know, but it certainly was more than he had ever done in any of his other books, which he just began and then kept writing. But at the beginning of chapter 21, he says, Mr. Pecksniff's house is more than 1,000 leagues away. And again, this happy chronicle has liberty and moral sensibility for its high companions. Again, it breathes the blessed air of independence. Independence and freedom are always capitalized, as if they are both ideas, but also something to be mocked, at least in the world of this novel as they are defined or as they are used. Again, it breathes the blessed air of independence. Again, inhales that sacred atmosphere which was the life of him, O noble patriot with many followers, who dreamed of freedom, capitalized, in a slave's embrace, and waking, sold her offspring and his own in public markets. And this is a reference to Jefferson. So this is 1842. So it's about 16 years. Doesn't Jefferson die in 1826, I think. So I love that in England, this is gossiped about, it's known about, it may seem as scurrilous. Maybe Washington Irving was offended by this trafficking in low gossip that, of course, we know to be true. And I just like the way that, so Pecksniff, who is an exemplary public man on a private scale in England, is linked to the hypocrisy, just as he's hypocritically. So the hypocrisy of this great public man, Jefferson, writ large, and that they're linked in that the two locations of the novel sort of are linked into a single message that, of course, there's no Eden, whether it's a small English town or London or the whole United States of America. At the closing of the chapter, and I won't read this whole thing, obviously, because it's long, is the chapter closes with Cyrus Choake's letter, which just keeps talking about freedom and how the crowd cheered 9 times, times 9 times, or something. And I just was thinking of rallies by he who shall not be named, that in which these words are invoked, but they have no meaning, and or they have a meaning that is at odds with the inequality that is also spouted at them. I mean, not so blatantly called inequality, but as all the people who are lesser than the people who are in the room. And it's, sir, I address you on behalf, this is the letter, of the Water Toast Association of United Sympathizers. And its encomium to the cause of freedom. Mindless cheers at the word freedom, which itself is a hollow word, rendered Pecksniffian in a way by its repetition into meaninglessness, cheered at but not understood. And then the closing of the chapter is so haunting and beautiful to that Martin Chuzzlewit is going up to his bed, and it says, and then was agreed by this group that their surplus of money should be devoted to aiding the enforcement of those free and equal laws which render it incalculably more criminal and dangerous to teach a Negro to read and write than to roast him alive in a public city. I mean, I think we're still having these same arguments, not in exactly those same terms. As Martin ascended to his bedroom, his eye was attracted by the Republican banner, which had been hoisted from the housetop in honor of the occasion, in honor of this absurd occasion, and was fluttering before a window which he passed. Tut, said Martin, you're a gay flag in the distance, but let a man be near enough to get the light upon the other side and see through you, and you are but sorry fustian. No. Question.
Discussion.
Dean, you into silence. Oh, Laura.
Thank you. That was very imaginative and creative. Thank you both. I was wondering if you thought Martin's conversion was religious or humanist. It seems at the time religious conversions were all the rage, especially as a device, but it didn't seem so, a little like Scrooge. It didn't seem religious. It seemed something more internal or environmental. I was wondering if you had an opinion on that.
What do you think of his dependency on Mark Tapley? He was embarrassed by it, right? He didn't reach out to help anybody else, but he was embarrassed about his dependency. So he hadn't thought of himself as a dependent person before that. But he was constantly petitioning or thinking of petitioning his grandfather for money. But I think that was it. I think it was his recognition that he was dependent on other people and he didn't ever act that way before. I didn't believe his conversion, but I thought it was a useful plot twist. The hypocrisy, right? Starting out one way, turning another. Not every character does, obviously. Mr. Pecksniff never did anything else, but Pecksniffian is.
I agree. I didn't believe the conversion, but it was a useful plot device. Although now when you were saying this, I was thinking of Sidney Carton and his transformation through A Tale of Two Cities, which I mean, maybe a little more better worked out anyway. I mean, it's not, it doesn't happen in one day. I mean, it's a whole planned thing. So I guess I felt it was like a useful plot device. I would have to read it through again to see any kind of religious meaning to it, although it feels to me that any overt religious implication would be somewhat satirical, given that it's happening in Eden. I mean, or part of it is happening in Eden. I mean, there doesn't seem to be anything taken very seriously about religion, partly because of what it makes people do or allows people to do or gives people cover to do. So I guess that's something that Tom Pinch at least plays music in the church. I mean, there seems to be more a key element of the church for Dickens somehow.
I read that it was the least popular of his novels and also his favorite.
Okay.
Can you explain why?
Well, I read the same thing.
Yes.
But what I thought was that he thought it was his greatest novel while he was writing it. And then in the 7th issue, his publisher comes and said, I'm gonna give you less money. I'm gonna dock you 150 pounds a month because it's not selling. And that was when he introduced this trip to America to try to gain readership. I don't know if it worked. I didn't read anything that said that it worked, that the novel ever became a bestseller. Does anybody else know?
I don't think it would become a bestseller. I mean, maybe he felt defensive about it. I don't know. I thought David Copperfield was his favorite
But
novel.
while he was writing, he didn't write David Copperfield.
No, he hadn't.
I think he blogged whatever he was writing.
Well, we didn't mention it, but he's also editing two literary magazines at the same time, writing and editing and publishing as Boz, right? Household Words and All the Year Round. So he's working with Mrs. Gaskell, all these other writers,
Children.
and he had another kid.
I think it was, I don't know that it was a commercial failure, out and out. It wasn't like nobody read it, but I think he was so popular that, I'm only gonna tell you what it says in the Penguin Classics introduction, that I think Pickwick Papers had been selling about 40,000 or had sold upwards of 40,000 copies, and this only sold 23,000 copies. So, it wasn't, I don't know how it worked out with the contract that Virginia talks about, but it's not a very pleasant novel, I guess. It was,
Yeah, no.
This, sorry, this is for Dick. This brings a question to mind that I think we've all got on our minds, which is, having read it, how would you recommend it to a friend? And it's a straight up question, because I think you could see through all kinds of the puppeteering and so forth that goes on, and yet I have an indecent pleasure in it that I'd be loath to try to explain. So why don't you try?
well, I don't know how successfully I did it, because when we're here for Oliver Twist, there were two friends, close friends of mine, who were going to be here tonight and aren't. So they didn't read Martin Chuzzlewit, and then all of a sudden not be able to come. I thought it was filled with wonderful writing, and I have to say, as I said, I didn't really see the connection between what we're learning about Pecksniff and then the larger critique of America until I was sort of preparing for this. So I think a lot of what Dickens does better in later novels, including like a character like Tom Pinch and his love affair, those things work out so much more sweetly and neatly in later books. So I think it's sometimes hard to look back at an earlier book, if it was his favorite, and see what advance it was on what came before. And just because he may have done these things better later doesn't mean there's not a lot of great pleasure in seeing him work it out, even what his themes are going to be, what his archetypes are going to be, what his magical converting plot devices are going to be, and that it's a little wearying, probably, if you've read David Copperfield and you know about Dora, or if you've read Little Dora and know about Little Dora, to see a proto Dorrit or Dora in is it Mary is the sister's name? And so why have the B+ version when you can have the A+ version? I don't know. I love the book.
That's just pretty lukewarm.
But wait,
No, but I love the book. I came to it because I needed to read my 13th of 15 Dickens novels, and sort of approached it worried that I wasn't going to enjoy it. And I love the book. So, but I couldn't recommend it as the first book that someone should read.
But you have to read that passage where he introduces Mary Gant. That was transformative. If you don't read that, you've not read Dickens.
And more Catholic.
And Mark Tapley. Yes, with his joy in sorrow.
And Paxton.
And
Paxton.
Pecksniff.
Why isn't the book called Paxton?
Well, that's the other thing. I mean, I think Martin Chuzzlewit is not the most interesting character. And when Laura asks about his conversion, I think the conversion is designed to give him a weight and an importance and a sort of characterological foundation that it doesn't really have. I mean, you're not really following the growth of a character in the way you might do with David Copperfield
Or Nicholas
Pip or
Nickleby.
something like that.
Nicholas Nickleby. He becomes a man. There's nothing happening with Martin.
No, and in Nicholas Nickleby, it's much more of a vaudeville. I mean, just moving from one scene to the next, but so
You're just,
I
you're just,
as I
you're
say, I
just
love the book.
disappointed there's no circus in this one.
I'm just glad it was a trollop and there wasn't another fox hunting scene. But, so I know that I guess I don't want to damn it with faint praise. I didn't read it as a homework assignment. Well, I sort of did. I came to a lifelong homework assignment, but I didn't feel that I could press it upon friends unwilling to read another 800-page book. I told them to read Pachinko instead. Pachinko.
I found the nature writing incredibly beautiful. And that was something I had not expected. The description of the sea on the way to America and the description of the winter day, which is half meant to be ironic since it's freezing cold and everyone wishes they had gloves, but it's still very beautiful. And I didn't know what to make of that, but that's something that I would certainly excerpt to give to people.
I mean, Dickens loved rivers. I mean, he loved the Thames, he loved the Mississippi. I mean, at least in his ability to describe it. There was something about America. I mean, I know he was there, but I kept thinking of Manon Lescaut and coming to Louisiana. What is it? She's in Louisiana, but there are no swamps. I forget what the landscape is. It's like a desert in Louisiana where she dies. That even though Dickens was there, I kept feeling that there was an unreality to the landscape that reminded me of Puccini's Manon Lescaut. But that's mine.
A question about Tom Pinch, which is that we all know the Too Good to Live heroines that he specializes in. But what do you make of Tom Pinch? What do you make of a character who looks at Pecksniff and believes it?
And then has a moment where he doesn't, like a curtain drops and he sees the man.
Yeah, he does.
Has that ever happened to anybody?
But oddly enough, that's the very point in which Dickens says over and over again that Pecksniff never existed. He says it about 6 times.
The man I created in my
And I
mind.
created, boy, I mean, he invented projection right there.
Brilliant. What does anybody else think? It's a discussion. You can all talk. Please.
Hadn't thought of it that way. That's wonderful.
And when Pecksniff goes off the scene, that's like the slowest, lowest impact of any major character leaving a novel. He just kind of gets written out. Right? He complains and he's gotten hit on his head and in his heart. And that's the last thing you hear of him. I mean, he just disappear.
I missed it.
I don't remember, but what you say about he was a character who I invented in my mind, and you made me think of Great Expectations and how, without giving away, in case people haven't read it, how one character is invested with a certain role, and then another character has that role, and just how that information can change completely what someone, well, what one character, one puppet thinks of another. But no, that's really very moving. And that's again, I mean, something that obsesses Dickens through, I mean, the same thing in Bleak House, you know, once we find out a hidden identity, that everything changes, including what pity we're supposed to feel for this person. So as the reader and as the other characters.
It's like Dickens really believes in revelation and not in the religious sense. But it's not so much a question of conversion, going from bad guy to good guy, as much as moments of profound self-awareness, where, and it is a question of projection, like suddenly becoming aware of who people are relative to someone else. That's what I found continually revelatory about the novel, was how many characters had that moment of extraordinary revelation, whether it was Tapley or Chuzzlewit.
I wish I knew, excuse me, more about Dickens' plans, because it's almost like, I mean, in Great Expectations, obviously that is thought out from the beginning, and who is the benefactor. But what's so interesting about what you say is, was it just going to be left to us to see through Pecksniff somehow with what Dickens is able to do? Or was it always planned that everything that Tom Pinch is saying would have a final shift? I mean, because you could still have Pecksniff revealed for what he is without having Tom Pinch. I mean, you could feel pity for Tom Pinch till the end, thinking, oh, he never saw through it or something. And that would also be something that Dickens would have to balance artfully. How could we see through it? How could he make us see through it, even though this character who had so much invested in Pecksniff didn't see through it?
That's why Trollope's wrong. That's why Tom Pinch is not a puppet. Tom Pinch had never had that moment of increased self-awareness and a sense of who Pecksniff was. Then he would in fact have been just if he sold just a puppet. But he wasn't. He had that moment.
Well, it's like the end of Middlemarch, and this is a larger, but where people say, people who didn't know Dorothea or later generations who only heard of Dorothea, as if she isn't just a fictional character, but there are new generations of people. No, I love this. You would have thought that she must not have been a very nice woman, because she marries one person and then she marries another. You just, that paragraph, that sentence is just heartbreaking. When I read it for the first time in college, and every time I've read it again, even though I know it's coming, I find it just heartbreaking. I mean, that there could be people afterwards thinking Dorothea, it wasn't a very nice woman.
Well, what do you think about the disillusion of Martin Senior, where he has this illusion of being decrepit and old and incompetent and following Pecksniff as a leader, being manipulated. And then in the end, he turns out to be the benefactor of everything that's good that's happening to anybody in the whole novel. In a grand plan. Did you enjoy that? Did you believe it? Was that a device? It was
Yeah.
hokey.
That's what
That's
I
very
thought.
hokey. Yeah, because like, how did he? I mean, it's a nice wrap up, but why? I mean, I couldn't figure out why. It wasn't strong enough, I don't think, in the novel. Do you think
You have
that
to
you
wrap
got?
it up.
You had to wrap it up? He got to page whatever. How many pages is it? 600, 700 pages. You need to wrap it up. But it's better than some novels I read now where there is no wrap up. I mean, it's like you get the sense that they had a deadline and they met it, done. They walked away. You wish they'd gone back and rewritten that last chapter. Oh, I don't know. I read a lot, so it could be any one of them, 100. Where, you're not satisfied at the end. But the disillusion, the illusion, Tom Pinch has an illusion of Pecksniff. Everyone else sees it, he's a creep. And then Tom Pinch finally, the veil falls and he sees him.
I'm not sure I always believed that Tom Pinch didn't see it earlier, so.
Yeah, he's
Just like Tapley, I mean.
well, he was pretending everything that was bad was good and everything that was good was bad. Tapley. No. We had a question.
Well, it wasn't a question, it was an observation, but Dickens seems to enjoy characters who act behind the scenes as forces of good.
Mhm.
And we can think of any number of them, what we've discussed in the last 2 years in this very room, and other rooms. Over and over again, even Mr. Hoffman is the hidden hand of good.
Right. And he goes into a steep decline,
Well,
doesn't he?
well, he does. Well, he does. But in our mutual friend, I mean, think about, there are hidden, the angels are hidden. You don't know they're there. This seems to be Dickens' view, that they're all around you, but you don't know who they are.
Thank you.
Want to say for Dickens' immortality that I kept thinking of Pecksniff and his daughters as being the originals of The Headmaster and His Daughters in Decline and Fall, which I think can be argued is the funniest book in the English in the 20th century. And I had forgotten that the headmaster's name is Fagin, so just in case you think that the Waugh family wasn't tracking. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Bill and Virginia. It's just wonderful, unimaginable. We'll see you in the fall, and the book will be Nicholas.
Beth,
Have a wonderful
Beth,
summer.
can you repeat that? They didn't hear that.
Nicholas Nickleby.